Good evening, everyone. We are reconvening the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission meeting for March 31st. We had met earlier today to get input from stakeholders around our financial assurance, around financial assurance in general, just an informational docket. Tonight we have an opportunity to hear from the general public around financial assurances specifically. And it's our chance to sit back and listen to your thoughts around this important topic as we continue to generate information and thoughts around the topic in preparation for an upcoming rulemaking in the future. We're not going to take roll call again, but I will let folks know that we do have 39 or 40 folks that have signed up in advance to speak tonight. Elected officials will get 5 minutes to speak and everyone else gets 3 minutes. And we're gonna try really hard to stay within those time frames because we do have a number of people that are interested in speaking, and even at 3 minutes, we're still looking at, well over 2 to 3 hours. So please be courteous. And if you are reading from a prepared statement for your public comment and you don't make it through in those 3 minutes, even if you do make it through, please don't hesitate to submit that written document to us. And we'll also take the time to go over it and read it at a future time. So with that, I believe—
Mr. Chair, I just want folks to know I am here, I am listening. I just got back from my first vaccine shot and I haven't had time to eat, so I'm grabbing food and I just don't want to be like eating and having it be recorded, but I am listening and thank you.
Right, and with that, Chairman Robbins is not with us tonight. He has a family obligation, and so I am acting as chair for this evening's meeting. So with no further ado, our first speaker tonight is Tim Howard, who's a trustee with the Superior Board of Trustees.
Hello.
Hello, Mr. Howard.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak to the committee tonight. My name is Tim Howard. I'm a recently elected trustee for the town of Superior. The opinions expressed here tonight are my own. I have an MBA in finance from the Wharton School of Business, and I'm employed by Stonecroft Capital, boutique investment bank. In the fall of 2018, Superior faced the prospect of a 30-well pad at the southernmost edge of our town, with a plan to drill under the Rocky Flats Superfund site, where plutonium fission cores were manufactured until 1989, and where recent soil samples demonstrated continued plutonium contamination. Ultimately, the permits were withdrawn after public outcry. However, the potential site highlighted several problems with our current financial assurance system. Highlands Resource Corporation, the foreign corporation submitting the original permits, was only capitalized to the tune of about 8 million British pounds. Drawing under Rocky Flats introduced a set of unknown future liabilities when considering plutonium contamination in the soil. The maximum bonding requirement for the company was $100,000 at the time. Lacking adequate resources to develop the site, it was likely that it was a pre-Senate Bill 181 gambit. It was purely a speculative play. Unfortunately, a subsequent flip to a larger operator would not necessarily have resulted in a deeper pocket being on the hook for potential liabilities during the build-out or operation, let alone the ultimate shutdown of the wells. Superior was lucky back in 2018 with the withdrawal of the permit applications. However, the case illustrates just how devastating underfunded financial assurances could be to a small town like ours. We know that while individual wells might take on average 80,000 to cap, the cost of fully closing down horizontal wells could be much higher. Even taking a modest 100,000 per well, there would have been a potential liability of 3 million just to cap that 30 well pad. There should not be a bonding maximum for a company, as it is likely that each well represents a future liability that needs to be funded. There needs to be an avenue to ensure that the liability shields do not disconnect the deepest pockets from the liabilities, especially once the limited peak production period is gone. A key aspect of managing long-term liabilities is to match the duration of offsetting assets with anticipated future cash obligations. Here's the problem. The volatility of the oil market, coupled with diminishing access to low-cost funding, means that many of the current operators will not be here to take care of their future liabilities. The one way that this can be addressed is to ensure that those future liabilities are fully funded at the time of permit approval. The bottom line, from my perspective as a town trustee, I want to ensure that we are capturing the totality of future costs and liabilities, and those future dollars are insulated from the volatility of the market or liquidity risks faced by individual operators and do not fall to Colorado State or our local taxpayers. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Howard, and spending some time this evening with us. Next up, we have Susan Noble, council member from Commerce City. Ms. Noble, I think you need to unmute yourself.
Now can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I got you off to a big start, didn't I? I hope I'm the last one out of the party to do this. Good evening, commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in the informational meeting for the public this evening. I'm in my second year as a first-time council person for Commerce City, and like so many of my peers in the Northern Front Range, I'm interested in the oil and gas activity proposed for the Northern Front Range in residential areas. This month, the Commerce City City Council approved robust oil and gas regulations, and I thank you for the months you invested in rulemaking that established the floor for public health, safety, the environment, and wildlife. The city attorney for Commerce City is participating tomorrow, and I will be listening. Tonight, I am speaking as a resident in the North. My focus are the facilities and equipment for the modern or unconventional mega well pads on the sites multiplying along and in residential areas. Here's one example. I know you're familiar with the Ivy pad in unincorporated Adams County. The COGCC scout card for Ivy shows 8 water tanks, 10 oil tanks, 12 VOC combustors, 26 separators. That's in addition to the 26 wells called out on that same scout card. We're not talking cute little pump jacks anymore, bobbing on the horizon. I have every confidence that the rulemaking will resolve the tsunami of financial assurances for wells, a potential tsunami given efforts to end reliance on oil and gas before the end of the life of these wells. I am concerned, however, that there is no defined scope for the COGCC oversight regarding financial assurances. For example, does the COGCC require bonding that stops at the wellhead? Will it stop at each well on a megapad? Will it encompass the water tanks, oil tanks, combustors, and separators on sites like Ivy and even more facilities? Does it account for spills on the land or leaks from pipes? If not, the COGCC, then does the local authority, a municipality or county become responsible if a mega well pad is abandoned or orphaned or left idle for years, or the company goes bankrupt and no one buys it because no one's buying oil and gas any longer? While your topic are wells and financial assurance for wells, I hope that you will also define the scope of the COGCC's and the state's responsibility for facilities and equipment on the surface. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Noble, for your comments and participating with us tonight. Next up will be Dr. Barbara Vasquez.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? I'm sorry, when I was promoted to panelist, it took quite a while to rejoin.
That's okay. We can hear you, Dr. Vasquez, and you have 3 minutes.
Yes, and I'd like to comment that I'm on satellite internet, so I apologize if there's a little delay in what I have to say.
Sure.
So good evening, and thank you for taking this time for public comment after the many hours you spent today listening to parties. I'm a resident of Jackson County, a member of Western Colorado Alliance, and other groups that have a vested interest in this topic. And I believe we can all agree that the basis for this rulemaking that you're undertaking is that the funding for plugging, abandonment, remediation, and reclamation is a basic cost of doing business and should not fall to the taxpayers. In the testimony today, several speakers divided the types of wells under consideration for financial assurance rulemaking into wells coming to COGCC requesting new permits, those existing wells, and orphaned wells. And speaking close to home, Jackson County is home to all three categories, unfortunately. My request to the Commission is to take the opportunity during this financial assurances rulemaking to future-proof the elements of those rules to ensure that in all cases, the industry and not the state bear the burden of cleaning up after themselves once the productive life of their wells and infrastructure is concluded. That future-proofing has several elements, some of which have come up in discussions today, but I wanted to go over a few of them. One is to eliminate self-bonding. When you look at the task that you discussed today of assessing the risk of an operator defaulting on the requirement to clean up, the implicit assumption is that big companies with deep pockets would certainly have the financial capability to close down a site properly. But we only need to look at the dramatically increased financial leverage in the industry over the last few years and the fragility of the industry in the face of the pandemic-caused drop in demand for their product to realize that past performance, now I'm talking like Wall Street, does not always predict future performance. And for this reason, let the market determine what the bond will cost the industry, but ensure that the full cost of cleanup in the form of a cash equivalent bond is held by the state. As many have said before me, eliminate blanket bonds. There's plenty of data to show that they are insufficient to cover the cost of cleanup. So set individual well and site bonds based on complexity and bore length, the depth and horizontal length of the well, the size of the site, the infrastructure on the site. This requires that COGCC staff create a flexible method to calculate that bond required to pay for plugging, abandoning, remediating, and reclaiming the infrastructure and the sites. And those variables are in hand at the time of the APD. So hopefully you and your staff will be able to create such a calculator. I also encourage you to create a trigger to require an increase in bonding indexed to inflation so that we don't have the cost of cleaning up the site run past what you've accumulated in funding. For existing wells, there have also been proposals to create mechanisms that would be triggered by a change in the status from producing to idle or a change in ownership to review and if necessary, raise the bond to the full cost of cleaning up the site. Finally, I'd like to close talking about reclamation. I sat on the BLM's Resource Advisory Council for Northwest Colorado for 7 years and was invited to view reclaimed sites that sported only a single species of grass and some invasives. So I'd like to echo Matt Sura and Matt Samuelson's request that the commission include a review and an update on reclamation rules in this rulemaking. The goal of reclamation is to return the site to a functioning ecosystem very similar to what existed prior to the disturbance of development, including the denuded and leveled pads for wells, tank farms, and other infrastructure and roads.
Dr. Vasquez.
I invite you also, I invite you to look at pictures of reclaimed sites around the state and apply your own common sense view of whether that reclamation was effective or not. Thank you for your time tonight.
And thank you for your comments and participating with us tonight. Next up will be Ramesh Bhatt. After Ramesh would be Doug Henderson and Fred Malo.
Hello. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I live in Boulder, Colorado. Within the last few weeks, we've had several bad alert days. Oil and gas production is a major contributor to this problem. Yet, the oil and gas industry is not paying for the health and economic costs of this pollution. Instead, we, the public, are paying. I'm mentioning all these things. I know all of you know these things, but I'm mentioning them because I want to point out that the oil and gas industry has a knack for externalizing costs. Unfortunately, apparently this kind of externalization of costs has also happened when it comes to dealing with oil and gas infrastructure after production is complete. Taxpayers are on the hook for billions of dollars because the COGCC did not require adequate bonding in previous years. And of course, the industry has been happy to go along. I'm here to urge you not to make that mistake again. The current bond levels are so inadequate that there's no incentive for operators to plug and abandon wells. Yet it appears that up to 10% of wells in Colorado have not produced anything at all in the last couple of years. Yet operators are hanging on because it's apparently more economical to do that than to plug and clean up. And there are also thousands of abandoned wells altogether. This kind of thing cannot go on. The system has to change fundamentally. The oil and gas industry has to pay the complete costs of cleanup after production is completed. Moreover, there should not be any incentives to hang on to non-productive or non-producing wells. Full bonding should be required and there should be cash equivalents. Also, there should be a cost for keeping wells on the books so that there's an incentive to plug and clean up when production is complete. I very much hope that you do the right thing here and protect the public rather than cater to industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bott, for your comments tonight. Next up will be Doug Henderson, followed by Fred Malo and Adrian Moline.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Mr. Henderson.
Okay, good evening, commissioners. I'm Doug Henderson. I live in Larimer County. I'm speaking for the Larimer Alliance for Health, Safety, and Environment, a coalition that represents thousands of Larimer County residents. Oil and gas has many financial costs that are externalized and avoided by the industry. Oil and gas operations collide with residential areas and neighborhoods. People suffer and get sick from these operations and emissions with big costs to their lives, families, and communities. Property values decline, causing losses to homeowners. Communities become embroiled in fighting against oil and gas, costing residents, local governments, and public agencies untold millions. Air and water get polluted with huge costs now and into the future. Billions of gallons of toxic waste get pumped underground. It's false to pretend that this won't have costly consequences. Many spills, explosions, and fires occur with costs to emergency services, people's health, and to the environment. And the list also includes thousands of old wells and sites left by operators for taxpayers to clean up. It is time that the oil and gas operators are required to pay their way, to cover all their costs from start to finish, to operate when and where it is genuinely profitable, not because it is subsidized by externalizing costs to others, to local communities, to local and state governments, and to taxpayers. At this point, Taxpayers are already facing the cost of plugging and cleaning up thousands of orphaned wells in Colorado, which will run to hundreds of millions. The oil and gas industry is unwilling to pay to clean up after itself. It is this commission's responsibility to make sure that going forward, the oil and gas industry acts responsibly and that operators are capable and responsible for fully covering costs. COGCC must require full cost bonding set at a level that provides real financial incentive to properly shut down, plug, and abandon wells, and to fully reclaim and remediate sites. Every well needs to be bonded. Inadequate bonding creates incentives for operators to escape properly shutting down and cleaning up sites. Allowing blanket bonding must be eliminated. In some cases now, the effective bond is under $1,000 per well. COGCC also should get serious about a mechanism for the oil and gas industry to pay for cleaning up orphaned wells and sites in Colorado, so taxpayers won't be left with the cleanup costs. The industry claims to be responsible toward the public and the environment. COGCC needs to be sure the industry and operators walk their talk from start to finish, including cleaning up after all their operations and at all sites, current, future, and past, instead of leaving it to taxpayers. We thank the commissioners and staff in COGCC who have genuinely embraced reform in oversight of oil and gas development in Colorado, including protecting taxpayers from undue financial risk and cost. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson, for being with us tonight and providing those comments. It sounds like I missed one of our elected officials. So Lori Anderson is with us tonight, and she is an elected official from, well, now I can't remember. I got to find her on my list. Erie, I believe, or Broomfield, I believe. So is Miss Anderson with us?
Yes, thank you. There's a short delay there. Thank you. Good evening. My name is Lori Anderson. Oops, let me see my window. And I'm a city council member in Broomfield representing constituents who live in close proximity to oil and gas development. I want to start by addressing a key point and then share some specific examples from Broomfield that support the need for increased financial assurances. Responsible operators are protected in a system with adequate financial assurances. When that responsible operator plugs a spent well, their surety bond is returned to them. It is the irresponsible operators that are targeted when the surety bond is set at an amount that would carry a significant financial penalty if they abandon their responsibility to plug and remediate a well. The current system isn't working, and we cannot rely on the industry to self-enforce. So the system seems like a fair way to hold the industry responsible while shifting the heaviest burden to irresponsible operators. The first example in Broomfield goes back a couple of years and establishes the need for methane monitoring to be required on all of our inactive and abandoned wells. Following requests from residents in our Anthem Ranch community, Broomfield moved forward with a soil gas testing program with a goal of monitoring all plugged and abandoned wells in Broomfield. It was through this testing that the Davis 43-6 leak in Anthem Highlands was discovered back in May 2019. Unfortunately, the original operator of this well was no longer in business. Davis 43-6 is located under Gramps Peak Way in the midst of a residential development where homes just a few lots away were under construction. Following the replugging of the well through the Orphan Well program, residual subsurface methane was detected, and monitoring of methane at various locations and depths still indicates levels of methane, some well above the lower explosive limit. These levels dissipate when the vent caps are off, but then build back up when the caps are replaced. There are now plans to move forward with trenching along both sides of Gramps Peak Way in an effort to try to increase the rate of methane mitigation in this area where the developer desires to again move forward with home building. Those permits are actually on hold right now. Fortunately for Broomfield, the state accepted and prioritized the failed Davis 43-6 well. However, the backlog of orphan wells increased by one that day. Bonding requirements and implementation should guarantee that the state has the resources to fully plug and remediate every well that a private operator does not fully plug and remediate. Even if operators go bankrupt or simply walk away, no Colorado community should be stuck with inactive or abandoned wells that are uncapped and unremediated. While Broomfield is not privy to the information regarding the financial status of older vertical wells that are producing or shut in, we do have an interest in our future development potential and having these wells plugged and abandoned. As each additional well is plugged and abandoned, we take a step towards removing a source of emissions and further reduce the potential for environmental impacts. The rules should prevent operators from gaming the system to avoid responsibility for fully closing and remediating wells. That includes preventing operators from keeping non-economic, low-producing wells operating primarily to delay capping and cleanup costs, preventing operators from avoiding responsibility by transferring wells to progressively weaker companies for the purpose of avoiding capping and remediation expenses, and ensuring that enforcement actions can be and are taken quickly enough to expeditiously resolve problems. The plugging and abandoning of stripper wells and other wells that have outlived their useful life must not be contingent on the drilling of new wells. For example, we have an example that's in Broomfield. Operators should not be incentivized to keep an old well in operation to hold a spacing unit. The Carlson 124 well is located in close proximity to Aspen Creek Elementary School. Despite this well failing a mechanical integrity test in June 2020, it was repaired and kept active as it holds the spacing unit for a boundary well. And those kids at that school deserve better. The city and county of Broomfield negotiated an operator agreement with Extraction Oil and Gas, which was signed back in October 2017 as the final offer from the operator. It was either these negotiated protections or no additional protections. This agreement included a 0% royalty lease on minerals owned by the city and county of Broomfield on our open spaces in exchange for additional best management practices. As this operation moved forward, the full impact of this project was realized, including excessive noise and air emissions that continued into production. The cost to the city for air quality monitoring alone has been substantial, with a cost of close to $1 million per year. The operator agreement included a clause that the operator would pay just $20,000 per year for air quality monitoring. Oil and gas expenses that we incur include outside legal and engineering services, air quality monitoring, noise monitoring, soil gas testing of abandoned wells, water testing, and our own internal expenses such as our oil and gas inspection program and health concern system, including our epidemiologist. These expenses outweigh any income from oil and gas activity to Broomfield. I appreciate the work that the Commission has undertaken to address financial assurances and look forward to the opportunity to provide further input. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson, for being with us tonight and providing comment. And I apologize, I overlooked you earlier. So next up, we have Fred Mallow, followed by Adrian Moline and Lori Brandt.
Commissioner Mesner, this is Hearing Officer Thomas. At the moment, we have not been able to locate Fred Mallow, Adrian Moline, or Lori Brandt. I'll continue to keep an eye out on them, but we should go ahead and move to Ann Jordan next.
And Jordan, you are up.
Good evening.
Good evening, Miss Jordan.
Can you see me?
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
Huh. Well, I'll go. I don't want to waste my time, so I'll go ahead without the video. Are you there? Can you still hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I want to focus my comments this evening on question 8 of your question list, the one about the advantages and disadvantages of approaches in reports such as the Technical Work Group report and the Idle Well report. My first point of 3 is that, importantly, these reports were not written with the Commission's new mission of protecting human health, safety, and the environment in mind. They focus instead on the operators, and the concept of equity in these reports refers to equity for small operators, not for all Coloradans. To this point, the Technical Work Group report is based on the opinions of operators. Specifically, of the 22 members of the group, 14 of them, which is 64%, were operators, and by contrast, 1% were environmentalists. Consequently, the report has an operator bias. For example, the $82,500 they suggest to plug, reclaim, and remediate a single well is an operator estimate. The Commission should, instead of using this, rely on its own actual numbers, the $282,000 per well cited by Director Murphy in the February 10, 21 COGCC meeting. Additionally, Well, I'll move to my second point. My second point is that the idle well report, also not written by stakeholders, but written by professionals, does include important suggestions the COGCC should follow. And I'll mention a few. First, consider revising the definition of inactive well to limit the ways in which operators avoid this definition and save themselves money. Also, limit the time before an idle well must be plugged. And also, adopt full single well bonding, and ask the state legislature to pass a bill to go back on former operators for cleanup funds. My third point is that while these reports offer many suggestions for changing the financial assurance program, the one single suggestion that makes the most sense is to require a single well bond of $280,000 per well. No need to make it complicated with numerous confusing funds. Just do what will cover the cost of plugging, reclaiming, and remediating the site. Colorado should not subsidize the oil industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Jordan, for your comments and for being with us this evening. Those comments were helpful. So next up is Lois Vanderkooi, followed by Heidi Leithwood and Janice Hallowell.
Oh, am I up? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, and I'm not showing up in person, it looks like.
We don't.
But I'm really here. Okay, Lois Vanderkooi, resident in Broomfield. And I so appreciate you listening to us. Personally, I'm frustrated at how the industry has operated in my community and state. I've observed that rather than respecting rights to health and safety, the industry denies problems and the real costs of doing business. It's not an honest and humble broker, but rather spends millions on advertising, lobbying, suing, and threatening to sue. A 2019 audit revealed that some operators underreported their production, which meant less financial support for state oversight. In Broomfield, the industry spent $500,000 to defeat a charter initiative and also supported campaigns of pro-oil and gas council candidates. Being a psychologist, I would consider these charming and bullying tactics as being rather narcissistic and sociopathic. They are likely based on fear of not surviving or making a profit. And that fear is well-founded, as it takes a lot of borrowing and investment to do these very expensive operations. The industry seems to thrive on taking large financial risks in the hopes of great gains. Reliant on commodity-based pricing, it is a boom and bust type of business, and the state hasn't gained near enough revenue from operations to protect the public and clean up the messes left behind. The intent of 181 is to do better. This means the industry should pay for the true cost of doing business. In Broomfield, our oil and gas expenditures were several $100,000 in 2017, and it was projected that we would suffer a $3 million net loss with the extraction project. With mega pads moving in and public outcry, expenditures topped $3 million in 2020 alone. If operators can't cover the cost of adequate liability insurances, surety bonds, air and noise monitoring, pneumatic devices, inspections, plugging, abandoning, reclamation, they should not be permitted to drill new wells. Also, the state needs to start covering its costs more in terms of severance taxes, fees, penalties, sinking funds, and other financial assurances so that we taxpayers aren't left holding the bag. This could also tie in with assessing the true cost of carbon as the bigger picture of the climate crisis is kept in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vanderkooi, for your comments and for being with us here this evening. Next up is Heidi Leithwood, followed by Janice Hallowell and Duncan Gilchrist.
Hi, commissioners. Thank you so much for hearing us today after your long day. I know how long it was because I was there as well. My comments tonight are based on what I heard this morning. I heard a lot of analogies being tossed around, and the one that came to my mind was paying a deposit and a cleaning deposit when you rent an apartment. So a landlord would never allow a prospective tenant to just argue that they are a responsible person and they promise to clean it when they move out. And they would never allow them to say they shouldn't have to give their deposit to the landlord because they have their own savings account to cover the cleaning costs and possible destruction of the property. Also in this analogy, the tenant is very incentivized to clean the apartment thoroughly and in a timely manner so that they can get their deposit back to put towards the next rental. My next point was said in more economic language by a couple of the presenters, but it came to my mind that the pushback by the industry on this issue proves the necessity for it. In other words, if they are so close to the edge of insolvency that they can't come up with their deposit, that means that the 100% bonds are all the more necessary. Mr. Delahanty made another excellent point, that the onus of evaluation of the risk would not be on the COGCC, but would be on the underwriters of the bond. There were some claims that there is not an impending orphaned well crisis, and I want to come back to the big picture of looking at the financial rulemaking under the larger umbrella of protecting the health and safety and environment. So in fact, one of the issues with all of the active low producing wells is not just that maybe they might become orphaned, but it's a problem that there are so many active low producing wells in the first place because they are all continuing to emit greenhouse gases. So there is a crisis right now. It's not just a potential financial crisis, but it's a dire health crisis, and it contributes to the climate emergency. My next point is that at first I wasn't sure that I correctly heard the argument against the full bonds put forward by the large operators. It almost sounded like extortion to me. If you make us provide 100% assurance, then we will stop doing the P&A, even though they're legally required. In fact, the 100% bond amount is such a tiny percentage of the revenue that they will receive from overall production of each well. Kate Merlin made an excellent point that fully bonding these wells would incentivize operators to plug the wells in a timely manner in order to regain their bond. Also, she made an excellent point that larger companies are not less likely to go bankrupt. The example that she gave showed a huge catastrophe in California. I understand that the orphan well plugging comes from the mill levy, which is not funded by the taxpayers, as you said. That mill levy amount fluctuates. And if it was $3.8 million this year, I did the math, and that's only enough to cover 42 wells at COGCC's own average cost. So what would happen if a large operator did go belly up?
Ms. Leithwood, if you could wrap up, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. One more thing, just that the financial assurances rules can protect us from when, but not if, oil and gas is a thing of the past. Many financial funds right now are divesting from oil and gas so they're not left with stranded assets. There will come a tipping point when everyone wants to jump ship, and what will happen then? What will happen if you have not received bonds for full cleanup costs from these companies? They will leave you holding the costs when they are suddenly no longer financially viable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Leithwood, for being with us here this evening. Next up is Janice Hallowell, followed by Duncan Gilchrist, and then Deb Bjork.
Okay, there we are. Can you see me and hear me?
Can see you and hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks for asking for input about improving the financial assurances rulemaking. Much has already been said, and I agree with most of it, but I want to bring up a topic that I feel needs attention, and that is the owner's problem of plugging wells with cement. Whenever we talk about the orphaned wells and plugging them with cement, it's taken as a given that they will need continuous monitoring forever because cement breaks down. It cracks, it erodes, and it's porous to begin with, so leaking happens. And as we know, when these plugged wells leak, methane, benzene, CO2, and other toxic chemicals leak into the air and groundwater and soak into the soil around the wells, leaving the well sites a toxic mess that goes on polluting for many years to come. It seems obvious that continuing to plug wells with cement is a poor solution. So I'm asking that while we're working on financial assurances, why not investigate better materials and technologies to plug the 60,000 orphaned wells in Colorado and those that will occur in the future? Better technologies do exist right here in Colorado, and they should be sought out. One example of an alternative technology that's possible right now is the use of solid wood-based carbon to plug the wells instead of, or possibly in conjunction with, other materials. Made from pyrolyzed beetle kill pine, solid carbon will effectively plug the wells. It will bind toxic chemicals for hundreds of years. It will use up beetle kill, which poses a wildfire threat all over the state. And because a huge amount of carbon will be sequestered, companies doing the work could potentially receive carbon credits. Fracking and oil wells range in Colorado from 2,000 feet deep to 14,000 feet deep. If you multiply that amount of space with roughly 60,000 plus orphan wells, that's a whole lot of space that could be used to sequester vast quantities of carbon. In October of 2020, the IPCC published a report that said that we won't be able to limit global warming to an increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius without significant carbon removal and sequestration. So putting carbon in solid pyrolyzed form into thousands of miles of wells would be a significant way to offset the CO2 increase causing global warming. This particular solution would make Colorado a leader in clean solutions to fossil fuel problems. So I'm calling for the COGCC to do something like forming a subcommittee or a panel to explore solid wood-based carbon technology and other alternatives to cement for plugging orphan wells. This is a panel that should not be made up of only oil and gas employees. We need environmental groups represented and knowledgeable climate scientists and engineers. We need people who know a lot more than I do about solid wood carbon capture, carbon sequestration, and then oil and gas companies should be required to use that technology. Thank you so much for your service and for listening tonight.
Thank you, Ms. Holloway, for your comments this evening and for being with us. Next up is Duncan Gilchrist, followed by Deb Bjork, and then Sam Allen.
Commissioner Mesner, we're not able to locate Mr. Gilchrist at this time. We'll keep looking, so we will move on to Ms. Bjork.
Sounds good. Good evening, Ms. Bjork.
Can you hear me? Sorry, I don't know why the video isn't working, but.
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Carbon Tracker has estimated that Colorado has financial assurance for only 2% of an estimated $8 billion liability for existing drilled wells, primarily due to blanket bonds. The COGCC can correct this astounding discrepancy in its financial assurance rulemaking. Colorado taxpayers should not be on the hook for paying industry costs. Operators must be required to cover the true cost of reclamation. There are currently nearly 60,000 abandoned wells in Colorado. The cost to fully plug and reclaim well sites vary, with estimates from $82,500 per well by Colorado regulators to North Dakota's recent average bonds of $180,000. Carbon Oil and Gas of Pennsylvania spent $700,000 per well to plug 3 wells in 2010. At the recent joint AQCC and COGCC meeting, Gary Kaufman made repeated statements that regulations need to be financially reasonable for operators. While he was referring to air quality regulations, the same sentiment has been expressed in COGCC rulemaking. I found that message astounding and the logic to be circular. Cost is not arbitrary. It is what it is. It's the cost of doing business. If an operator cannot afford to cover reclamation of current wells and infrastructure, why would regulations allow additional permits for companies to drill more wells, which could also purportedly not have full coverage bonds? The industry has said it cannot afford to cover the true cost of reclamation. Yet by using readily available data, Carbon Tracker found that the largest operators in Colorado only pay average premiums of 32 cents per well per year, and smaller companies an average of $3.47 per well per year. And doing the math, those same blanket bonds would only pay out $31.53 per well. Bond premiums don't cost too much, they cost too little. It's much cheaper for companies to pay premiums indefinitely rather than to plug wells. Operators can keep wells idle and once identified as such, pay a fee of either $10,000 or $20,000 rather than the potential of the cost of plugging. This too kicks the can down the road for Colorado taxpayers. Idle wells are estimated to emit 10% of total methane of the oil and gas sector, causing a huge environmental cost as well. Another huge loophole in regulations is that larger companies often sell stripper wells to smaller companies and then claim no future responsibility for reclamation costs. This is a sword of Damocles hanging over Colorado taxpayers. Weak state regulations will dump enormous future economic and climate costs on the taxpayer. Please be bold and require full cost of reclamation for wells and related infrastructure, strengthen the requirements for plugging idle wells, and require full bonding responsibility across the chain of ownership. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bjork, for your comments. Next up, we have Sam Allen, followed by Benu Aman-Ray, and then Arthur Hirsch.
Commissioner Messner, we were able to find Mr. Gilchrist, so if you don't mind, we will move to him first and then go to Mr. Allen.
That sounds good. Mr. Gilchrist, come on down.
Good evening, commissioners, and sorry about that. I was logged into a Zoom account of one of my colleagues and not my own.
Okay.
But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to hear the public's thoughts and concerns this evening after a long day. My name is Duncan Gilchrist. I live in Boulder, Colorado, and I am a climate policy analyst with 350 Colorado. So as you just heard, Carbon Tracker, a think tank, estimates that it will cost $8 billion to plug all of Colorado's 60,000 unplugged wells. And yet our state holds a meager $160 million in individual and blanket bonds, equaling only 2% of the estimated plugging costs. This dangerous present circumstance is the result of a program that disincentivizes operators from plugging wells and reclaiming production sites on their own. To remediate this problem, I'm here today to just echo requests of a broad spectrum of stakeholders, requests that you've probably heard over and over again at this point. So I apologize for redundancy, but these points are very important. Within the 700 series rulemaking, please require full cost individual well bonding and eliminate blanket bonding. Further, when it comes to assessing non-performance risk, an important task that the state is not fully qualified to do, a wise approach would be to let the financial markets underwrite and price the non-performance risk of individual operators. This free market approach would ensure that the 1% of operators that pose little risk now can obtain adequate prices from the surety bond market. Of course, premiums and collateral requirements will be higher for the other 99% of our operators, the smaller undercapitalized operators, but this is how a free market is supposed to work. These improvements to Colorado's financial assurance program would be in line with the COGCC's mission to regulate the development and production of natural resources of oil and gas in the state of Colorado in a manner that protects public health, safety, welfare, and the environment and wildlife resources. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Gilchrist, for your comments and being here with us tonight. Those were helpful. So next up, we have Sam Allen, then Benu Aman-Ra, and then Arthur Hirsch.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Allen. We can hear you and see you.
Thanks. The oil and gas sector is likely contributing more to greenhouse gas emissions than in what is commonly attributed. Factoring in estimates of the greenhouse warming potential of methane, considering the estimated leakage rate to be 4.1%, and considering the total life cycle of transportation and use of natural gas, the amount of emissions the oil and gas sector produces accounts for near a majority of the state. This is being exacerbated partly due to abandoned sites. In Colorado, one estimate is 0.09 tons per year per well for unplugged versus 1.8 times 10 to the negative 5 for plugged wells. Seems most abandoned wells are emitting methane in the US. One estimate is that 15% of abandoned wells are emitting at a higher level. Some goals of financial assurance is to ensure that the regulations are based on data of full costs. The costs will address the needed remediation. Reclamation could focus on those wells that may be emitting the most methane or causing the most harm, and that financial assurance will be tied to ownership. The bonding coverage right now is insufficient. Seems there is a disincentive to pay for plugging wells because the bond coverage that companies pay is only a small fraction, maybe around 1% of the estimated costs to plug abandoned wells. The blanket bonds that are currently in place provide coverage for $31 to $600 per well, depending on how it's measured, much less than the low estimate of $30,000. More broadly, Colorado holds $160 million in individual and blanket bonds. One estimate is that it will cost $7 billion to plug the unplugged wells in Colorado. Grant, there are other fees, and bonding doesn't seem to be the only assurance for decisions on inactive wells. It seems to be a main tool. It appears that companies can pay significantly less in their bonding fees, which means the finances needed to plug wells, the assurance that there will be finances, fall to the state. More bankruptcies occur at a greater rate. This will accelerate the lack of finances available. If reducing the number of abandoned wells and reducing the associated environmental impacts is a goal, then fewer wells being drilled would help. The COGCC could and ought to issue fewer permits. Preventing problems before they occur seems to be a factor that is sometimes dismissed. Minimizing the cost to the state for being liable for plugging and remediation of wells is in the state of Colorado's interest, and by implication, COGCC's. Importantly, the externalized costs affect the environment. Equity is of value. Impacts from development to wildlife, their habitat, vegetation, and soils ought to be considered. It seems to be another factor that should be considered with regard to financial assurance. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Allen, for your comments tonight. Next up is Benu Amun-Ray, then Arthur Hirsch, and Blake Humphrey.
Commissioner Messner, we're unable to locate Benu Amun-Ra at this time, so we will move to Arthur Hirsch.
Sounds good. Good evening, Mr. Hirsch. You just need to unmute yourself.
Good evening. I think I'm unmuted. Hopefully you can hear me and see me. I'm on a satellite delay, so I need to be a little bit out of sync.
We can hear you.
My name is Art Hirsch, and I'm an environmental. My name is Art Hirsch, and I'm an environmental engineer who represents the Boulder chapter of the Climate Reality Project that was founded by Nobel laureate and former Vice President Al Gore in 2006. Oil and gas development is a dying business in Colorado. Many oil and gas companies have or will be going bankrupt and are carrying so much debt that it's significantly impacting their bottom profit margins. The future of oil and gas demand and profits look bleak. And this condition represents a financial, health, and climate risk to the citizens of Colorado. I'm concerned about the 60,000 plus abandoned and orphaned wells in the drilling production areas that have been poorly managed by the permitting operator, the commission, and the state of Colorado. How did this number get so large? This current situation is a gross negligence by the commission, the state of Colorado, to protect our residents' health and our climate. It appears that the oil and gas operators in the commission may plan to use a Superfund approach to address the abandoned and orphaned wells, meaning they extract the readily available resources and then they walk away from the cleanup liability. In other words, they expect the city, the Colorado public, and the federal government to pay for the cleanup costs as they declare bankruptcy or sell their permits or leases to another oil company. The overall cleanup costs can exceed billions of dollars that should be absorbed by the oil and gas operators and not the public. There simply is not enough money required by the state of Colorado and the commission to hold oil and gas operators accountable through bonding. The bonding dollar amount requires should cover all site remediation and proper well and pipeline abandonment. And right now it's not adequate. To be clear, full bonding is necessary and essential. Both the commission and the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment have known about this lack of necessary bonding for years. These abandoned and orphaned wells known to be a major source of greenhouse gases in Colorado. In addition, non-stabilized drilling pads, production areas can cause both water and air pollution impacts that affect both the local and regional environment. It's doubtful that the commission and the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment has a real handle on the integrity of the transfer pipes from the wellhead to the storage tanks to the storage transfer facilities and beyond.
Mr. Hirsch, you just muted yourself.
Okay. Yes, so in closing, here are my recommendations. The commission should have limited discretion to exempt oil and gas operational areas from reclamation and well plugging requirements. The commission should require bond amounts to ensure the decommissioning and reclamation of all well infrastructure, such as water impoundments, waste facilities, pipelines, and wellheads are addressed. The commission needs to require bonds that are site-specific reclamation bonds that are set for the full actual cost of the decommission and reclamation. The commission needs to review bond amounts annually and increase them as necessary due to inflation or unexpected plugging costs. After a well is idle for 3 years, regulators need to require the operators to plug the well. Permits should not be transferable. New owners must be required to reapply for permits to ensure full cost reclamation is happening and bonding. Finally, the Colorado Attorney General and the Commission should not allow offloading the purchase of wells to other parties' wells to avoid site remediation costs. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Hirsch, for your comments this evening and for taking the time to be here. Next up is Blake Humphrey, followed by Shayna Oliver and Susan Fryer.
Commissioner, no sign of Blake Humphrey at this time, so we'll move on to Shayna Oliver. Also, no sign of Susan Fryer yet. I will notify you if she shows up when it's her turn to speak.
Okay, thank you.
Hello?
Good evening, Miss Oliver. We can hear you and
Okay.
see you.
All right, thank you. My name is Shayna Oliver. I'm a field organizer for Equal Madres Moms Clean Air Force Colorado, a national organization of moms, dads, caregivers united in fighting for all children's rights to breathe and play in clean air. Colorado is the 10th worst state for poor air quality according to the State of the Air report by the American Lung Association. And over 37,000 members in Colorado are looking up to the leadership to mitigate for cleaner air Most importantly, I am an Indigenous mother of 4. We are the descendants of the genocide known as the Indian Removal Act, known to the Dene as the Long Walk of the Navajo. These types of policies and violations have run a long historic impact on Indigenous people, community, health, wealth, and environmental well-being. We are marginalized and segregated to live and work in communities that lack access to clean air, water, adequate housing, healthcare, and education. As a tribal affiliate of the Navajo Nation, I've seen the devastation of land degradation and health impacts contributed by coal, uranium, oil, and gas. Because of these disparities, Indigenous people now have the highest rates in asthma, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, leukemia, adverse birth outcomes, premature deaths than general population. I was born prematurely, low birth weight, and with a birth defect, and diagnosed with asthma as an infant. When Indigenous people leave the reservation, we are segregated to live and work in communities where housing are a lot closer to industrial zoning areas, Superfund sites, and highways. Scientists have known for decades that air pollution is harmful to health, and this is especially true for vulnerable populations such as older adults, people with underlying health conditions, communities of color, low-income communities, pregnant women, and children. COGCC must ensure that the community's public health and environment by ensuring that oil and gas industry pays to clean up their own mess. If a company cannot afford to operate safely and meet all of the end of life and reclamation costs, they cannot be allowed to operate. Moms are looking for Colorado leaders, agencies to take action on climate change by moving away from dirty fossil fuels and increasing assurance of cleanup of oil and gas operations on new and existing well sites, and to protect our children's health and to provide safety and environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Oliver, for testifying this evening and sharing your thoughts. Hearings Officer Thomas, I do not remember who is next.
No sign of Susan Fryer, so we will move to Mark Waltermeyer.
Okay, Mark Waltermeyer is up.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to comment tonight. I appreciate it. My name is Mark Waltermeyer. I live and farm outside of Hotchkiss, Colorado in Delta County. I'm a board member of and represent the Valley Organic Growers Association, VOGA. VOGA is a membership nonprofit organization representing over 150 small and medium-sized farms in the North Fork Valley of Western Colorado, along with associated businesses and supporting individuals. VOGA members grow vegetables, fruit, dairy animals, meat, eggs, flowers, grain, wine, grapes, and other agricultural products. Current COGCC bonding levels are inadequate to fully protect VOGA members, as well as other citizens, local governments, and the state of Colorado taxpayers. We should not be held responsible for absorbing cleanup costs and damages caused by oil and gas operations. I'm particularly concerned about potential damages caused by oil and gas operations to VOGA members' farms and businesses. We are downstream from current oil and gas operations, proposed oil and gas operations, and public lands with extensive federal mineral leases. The concern of VOGA members is that the financial burden resulting from incidents that occur on these lands will fall to us. Our farms are irrigated by surface water that drains from the areas with active and proposed oil and gas activities. Significant incidents threaten this irrigation water, and contamination of this irrigation water would result in direct damage to our lives and businesses. Compounding this worry is the damage that our reputation for clean, healthful food would suffer from an incident. Damage that would occur even without direct contamination. We would like to see financial assurances adequate to cover direct damage to farmland downstream of oil and gas activities, and adequate enough to cover the damage to reputation we would suffer from an incident upstream of us. In all fairness, our thriving industry cannot be sacrificed to another industry whose activities endanger it. Nor should we as farmers have to rely on a lengthy and expensive legal process to potentially recover damages. Please adopt financial assurance mechanisms in whatever appropriate form that ensure taxpayers do not absorb the operator's cost of regulatory compliance, and that ensure direct and indirect damages are not shouldered by those affected by incidents. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Waltermeyer. And on a side note, I miss getting vegetables from you at the Gunnison Farmers Market.
You'll have a chance again this summer. I'll be there.
Thanks for being with us this evening. And next up is Betsy Ann Leonard, followed by Marcia Woodland and Sharon Byers.
Commissioner, we have no sign of Betsy Ann Leonard, so we'll move to Marcia Woodland. And then the next one that we have a sign of is Rutilio M. Martinez. So we will move to them next.
Okay, sounds good.
Hi, can you see me?
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
Okay, well, that's probably good enough. I'm speaking this evening as a concerned Colorado citizen and also a concerned global citizen. And I concur with the points that have already been made this evening. And so there's probably no point in taking up time reiterating points that have already been made. I'll just summarize a couple of points. Abandoned existing and new oil wells must be adequately plugged to prevent environmental problems and human health issues. The public should not be left paying for the shutdown and cleanup. Financial assurances are an important issue for new permits, but who will pay for all the abandoned wells in Colorado? It's not fair that this falls on the taxpayers. Plugging abandoned wells is a huge financial, environmental and health crisis, and it's getting worse. Again, the taxpayers shouldn't be stuck with paying for this. And it's critical that at a minimum, new permits be adequately financially backed. Every well must be bonded, and the bond amounts must be appropriately calculated. So I thank you for offering me the opportunity for public comment.
Thank you, Ms. Woodland, for your comments tonight and taking the time to be with us. So next up is Rutilio Martinez, and then followed by Brad Claffin and Mary Badowski. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. My name is Rutilio Martinez. I have lived in Fort Collins for 28 years. I recently retired from the University of Northern Colorado, where I was a professor of statistics and economics for 27 years, something like that. The points I'm going to make have already been made several times during this conversation. Nonetheless, I would like to mention them again. According to Carbon Tracker, there are at least 60,000 orphan wells in Colorado. These wells emit toxic emissions. According to some estimates, those emissions are equivalent to the emissions emitted by 90,000 cars. So these wells have to be plugged, have to be, let's say, put totally out of commission. According to figures of the COGCC, to pay for the clogging of these wells will be a minimum of $5 billion. Also, according to figures of the COGCC, the maximum amount of money that the state of Colorado has to pay for this operation is $185 million. That's maximum. So that means that the taxpayer will have to pay a minimum of 96% of plugging these wells, or plugging these wells. Mhm. And the operators will have to pay a maximum of 4%. That is very unfair, and from the perspective of property, or from the perspective of just basic microeconomic theory, that is very economically inefficient. Therefore, to avoid this situation in the future, would be a good idea to consider some of the following points, Okay, before issuing any permit, okay, what is the current and the projected cost, realistic cost of plugging a well? The current and the realistic current condition of financial condition of each operator. It's also necessary to consider the fact that most shale operators had losses in 2020, and the great majority of them have heavy debts. And finally, the fact that all the major oil corporations, like BP, Total, the French company, Shell, the Dutch company, they are engaged in a process of disinvestment from their traditional operations, which signals that the market for oil in the future will be generating no profits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martinez, for being with us tonight and providing those comments. Next up is Brad Claffin, followed by Mary Badowski, and then we're going to take a break after that.
Okay, am I unmuted?
You are unmuted.
Thank you very much, commissioners. My name is Brad Claffin, and I am testifying on behalf of the Colorado Native Plant Society, a nonprofit organization dedicated to furthering the knowledge, appreciation, and conservation of native plants and habitats of Colorado through education, stewardship, and advocacy. We have 4,400 members statewide and were founded in 1976. The process of revegetation will, I would like to highlight points you should consider regarding vegetation costs and procedures as part of the price of financial assurance. The process of revegetation will take years, and there is no quick fix to accomplish it. Financial assurance needs to account for that entire years-long process. You will be dealing with topsoil, which has been stored, perhaps improperly, for years and has lost its living character. You will be dealing with roads and well pads with heavily compacted soils, perhaps impacted by spills of toxic liquids and other materials. Once the soil to be revegetated is disturbed by disking or other methods of seedbed preparation, noxious weeds laying dormant in the seedbed are likely to sprout. If these are allowed to go to seed, which can occur as early as June, seeds will spread nearby, and it will take exponentially increasing efforts to remove them in future years. As a weed warrior in Colorado state parks, I have witnessed this all too often, as I was just in Chatfield today and pulled 150 weed plants. Noxious weeds are a major threat also to rare native plants, which most frequently occur in remote locations. Removal and monitoring costs in these remote areas will be much higher than on more accessible areas in the Front Range, and this should be accounted for. As an arid state, Colorado has a relatively inhospitable climate for revegetation seed germination and establishment in the wild when the ground is bare. Proper timing of seed planting with our infrequent rains and low soil moisture will be essential. If required, providing supplemental irrigation to achieve establishment will be expensive. Initial revegetation efforts may well fail, incurring costs to redo the process. Financial assurance should cover these potential costs. The current reclamation rules in Series 1000 are no longer appropriate under Senate Bill 181 or current best management practices. They are based on outdated concepts and science of what is required for true reclamation. The goal of current reclamation best practice is to reestablish natural plant and associated invertebrate communities, not just achieve the 80% uniform coverage as required now by rules 1003E2 and 1004C2. Since reclamation standards will directly impact reclamation costs and the financial assurances needed to assure them, a formal rulemaking process should proceed at a formal reclamation rulemaking process should proceed at the same time as this financial assurance rulemaking, using reclamation experts to apply the best current science. Thank you for your consideration of these comments.
Thank you, Mr. Clefait, for being here this evening and providing comment. Next up is Mary Badowski.
Yeah, hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Good evening, commissioners. I appreciate the opportunity to speak this evening. My name is Mary Badowski, resident of Larimer County. I know it's been mentioned multiple times, but I also ask COGCC to hold the oil and gas industry accountable by requiring full cost bonding and do away with blanket bonding. We are already seeing the cost to remediate orphaned wells exceeding what has previously been estimated to properly plug and abandon wells. As a resident of Northern Colorado, where much of the existing oil and gas infrastructure dates back 50 to 100 years, I ask the COGCC require operators to address their aging and failing infrastructure before permitting additional multi-well sites. They need to be held accountable for the reclamation of current wells and infrastructure before they develop more. I appreciate COGCC has included ways to address some of these wells needing to be plugged and abandoned when they are within a spacing unit for a new application. However, I think it is important COGCC also hold each operator accountable for their inventory. Please find ways to address the at-risk inventory before it becomes an orphan well. Rather than requiring operators with a high percentage of long-term shut-in or temporarily abandoned wells to provide additional bonding, please require operators to properly plug and abandon some of these wells before permitting additional wells. I think it's extremely important full cost bonding be required on each and every well, but I also think we cannot ignore the existing aging infrastructure that is being put off by industry and sometimes sold to smaller operators with fewer resources. I ask COGCC to write these changes into financial assurance rulemaking. As you look at data to better formulate protective financial assurance rules, please also consider doing a risk assessment for inactive wells. Determine what is the risk over time and what other factors may contribute to an inactive well becoming an orphan well versus being put back into production status. This will help you better define a timeline to mandate plugging and abandoning these wells. I also do not feel it is acceptable to allow an operator to keep a well in an inactive status just to keep a lease on that area. I thank you for considering my comments and concerns this evening.
Thank you, Ms. Badowski, for providing comment tonight. Commissioners, we have a break scheduled for 7:15. It's 7:18, so how about taking a break till 7:30? Okay, we'll see everyone again at 7:30 where we'll reconvene. Thomas, did any of the folks that we have skipped over show up that you're aware of?
Commissioner, I checked a couple minutes ago during the break and no. So the only one that is not appeared that's remaining is Mara Fielding. The remaining list is all present to speak.
Great, thank you. So next up then will be Carla Teal, followed by Al Lawande and Connie Beach.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Yes, my name is Carla Teal, and I'm a resident of Thornton, Colorado. And in reference to the effects of poor accountability and lack of financial assurances by the industry, I would like to take time to remember the 4th anniversary of a tragic event that occurred in Firestone, Colorado in April of 2017. Let us remember that 2 men were killed and a home destroyed. Investigators say the explosion was caused by odorless, unrefined natural gas leaking from a severed flow line. The line was believed to be abandoned, but was still connected to an operating well with the valve turned to the open position. The flow line was severed about 10 feet from the whole house, and gas seeped into the house's basement. This well and pipeline were in place several years before the house was built. This incident is a tragic example of non-accountability of the oil and gas industry, and hopefully an issue that by addressing financial assurances can be prevented in the future. Occidental Petroleum's subsidiary was fined by you for their reckless behavior, but this doesn't help the losses of Erin Martinez living in the home. She lost her husband and her brother. I understand that there is no clear trigger at this time for declaring a well as abandoned and requiring cleanup. Holding the industry accountable for their actions instead of allowing them to never declare a well dry and abandoned and subsequently declaring bankruptcy has allowed costs to for cleanup and plugging to be non-accountable by the industry. Please consider in your upcoming rulemaking for financial assurances that your actions not only affect each of us as taxpayers, but also affect the viability of the environment needing to be restored to its natural state and to safeguard the health and well-being of the citizens and wildlife of Colorado. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Teal, for your comments and for being with us this evening. Next up is Al Lawande, followed by Connie Beach, and then Nancy York.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the break. I thought I detected a little bit of eyes glazing over on the screen, and they seem to be refreshed. My name is Al Lawande. I live in Ridgeway, Colorado. I am not an elected official. I am not an expert in any aspect of this hearing. I'm just an ordinary citizen. But last time I checked, the legislative bill 181 requires the regulatory apparatus in Colorado to represent us regular citizens rather than cheerleading the industry. So I'm mighty glad to see that. So far, I've been very encouraged by the results of many of the other rulemakings. And I hope that this one turns out just as encouraging. I have to say, I've heard several estimates of what taxpayers are on the hook for, but all of them have been in the multi-billions. And you know, if a politician proposed a tax increase of that magnitude, he would be skewered alive. All hell would break loose. And yet the so-called regulators of the past have allowed essentially that tax to be assessed on the taxpayers of Colorado. I hope that you will not only put a stop to those ridiculous practices, but somehow try to claw back some of what's already been lost, if that's at all possible. You know, blanket bonding is a particular irritant to me. There's lots of them, but the industry clearly wrote that part of the regulation, but they must have had a hard time keeping a straight face doing it. That's just so absurd that every individual well does not have its own bond, and an adequate one. You know, you guys are tasked with doing the right thing here by ordinary Joes and ordinary taxpayers. I hope that that's a responsibility you take seriously. You know, the industry cries a lot about how regulation is going to cost jobs. Somehow, I don't think that the money they've saved all these years by not being responsible about cleanup has gone to creating jobs. It's gone to lining the pockets of already very wealthy owners and executives. So I personally, when I hear all these cries from the industry, the only tears I can cry are of the crocodile variety, I've got to admit. It's time they stepped up to the plate and assumed their responsibilities. I don't know how much you can even do about all the past damages, but you can surely see that nobody gets any additional permits until their responsibilities for abandoned wells are taken care of. And this little shell game of passing on old useless wells to smaller and smaller companies until they finally go bankrupt and leave us all on the hook, man, you got to do something about that. That's just abominable. Anyway, I thought you might appreciate the perspective of someone who only knows enough about the subject to be dangerous, but probably represents millions of Colorado citizens. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Luande, for your comments tonight and spending the evening with us. Next up is Connie Beach, followed by Nancy York and Richard Rudin.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm not sure if you can see me. I don't see the light on my camera, but thank you. Thank you, commissioners, for the opportunity to speak tonight. My name is Connie Beach, and I'm just a regular citizen. I live in Adams County and have for the past 15 years. I'm very interested in this subject, and I guess I'll reiterate some things that have already been said since we're awake after the break. But I do believe that there needs to be an end to the blanket bonding, and bonds should be based on the actual cost of the reclamation of each well. And I'm not as generous as some of the other people. I believe that if a well has not produced in 12 months, it should be required to have mechanical integrity tested and increase the bond, or force them to plug it. As previous people have said, the little shell game that the oil and gas industry have gotten into doing is detrimental to the health and safety of Colorado, but also our financial purse strings. I mean, we can't afford to plug and cap all these wells. I believe that if a company cannot afford to operate and reclaim at the end of the life, they shouldn't be allowed to have a permit. On top of that, if a company is asking for a permit and they have an abandoned well that hasn't been reclaimed, capped, and secured, I don't think any new permit should be granted to that particular operator. You know, having a well sit idle for years that may never see market conditions to justify renewing it shouldn't become a problem for the state of Colorado and our taxpayers. And I guess that's all that I have to say. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you, Ms. Beach, and thank you for spending the evening with us and providing those comments. Next up is Nancy York, followed by Richard Rudin, and then Jacob Smith.
Okay. Good evening, commissioners. Thank you for taking citizen input. Given the harmful impacts of oil and gas emissions on human health, the environment, as well as contributing to the warming of planet Earth, I ask that you hold the industry to a very high standard. Each well needs to be bonded sufficiently to cover plugging and thorough reclamation. Consider requiring insurance to cover reclamation or plug failures, and reject blanket bonding. With regards to idle wells, it is essential that all toxic emissions be prevented from seeing the air, and the site is monitored. I urge requiring inspections and testing every 3 months. And please set a limit of time for plugging. It is very important to plug orphan wells as soon as possible. And I hope that you find the financial means to do that. I do think that this should not fall on the taxpayers' backs. I have read too that over time cement plugs crack from deterioration, water, and freezing. I think more study needs to happen and experimentation to make sure to try to correct this. Otherwise, we were going to have continuous emissions of methane, and we're not going to get too far. Again, consider insurance that might cover these failures. Thank you very much, and you've had a long day, and I hope this goes very quickly. Bye.
Thank you, Ms. York, for providing comment tonight. Next up is Richard Rudin, followed by Jacob Smith and Steve Walcott. Mr. Rudin, I think you have to unmute yourself.
You didn't hear all those nice things I said about y'all?
Not yet, but you can feel free to repeat them if you like.
Thank you for these long and tedious hours that you guys are always putting in. The public appreciates it. I know I do. Okay, my name is Richard Rudin. I am president of the Terra Creek Ditch and Reservoir Company. I have previously raised concerns with this commission about the precarious position of Terra Ditch within Terra Canyon in the North Fork Valley. In particular, with regards to geological hazards during the emission change rulemaking. I'm speaking today to highlight yet another engineering report that says it's dangerous to allow induced seismicity from any source into the Terra Creek Canyon. At the request of many of the decision makers that are aware of our problem, as all have asked, what can be done to mitigate and what are the costs? The engineering feasibility report I shared with you answers both those questions and more. There are a couple of possible mitigations that may or may not be permitted by the BLM, and they all come with astronomical costs. It is the position of Terra Creek Ditch and Reservoir Company that we will take full responsibility for our ditch if the state will just leave us alone. If you induce artificial risk into our system, then you should fully take responsibility for the cost of these mitigations, which will be in the millions, as well as potential financial losses from water disruption, which could also easily be in the millions. Moving our ditch into the hillside will cost $3.25 million. You have the exact figures, and need to be permitted with no guarantee that it would be permitted, and no guarantee that it would then protect the weak geologies below the ditch. As the Geological Survey said, the real danger above and beyond what you can see is the 15 or 20 feet below where I stand on the ditch bank. A pump station at the bottom of Terra Creek might work, but it too will face permitting and legal challenges, cost $1 million plus to construct, and incur $200,000 of electrical charges annually forever. There is now consensus by the engineering community that, quote, any significant seismicity from collapsing underground mine works or hydraulic fracturing could increase the likelihood of slope movement above or below the ditch that could compromise the ditch itself. So my questions are, with the full understanding that even production wells may cause seismicity and therefore demand mitigations in a geological hazardous area, I respectfully ask, 1, what is the process to ensure TDRC has the financial assurances to cover the cost of these mitigations? And if that one pump station is chosen, who's going to pay the $200,000 in perpetuity? 2, who would be initiating the NEPA analysis with the BLM to see if mitigations are even permittable? 3, who would be paying for this NEPA? And lastly, how will Terra Ditch and Reservoir Company be protected directly from any damages incurred without a long and costly lawsuit? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rudin, for participating again this evening and providing those comments. Next up is Jacob Smith, followed by Steve Walcott. And unless there's anyone else that we had skipped over that's in the queue, batting cleanup is Heidi Cedar-Keshet.
Great. Well, thank you, Commissioner Mesner. Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Jacob Smith. I serve as the Executive Director of Colorado Communities for Climate Action. CC4CA is a coalition of 36 local governments from around the state working to strengthen statewide climate policy. Our members range from under 1,000 in population to more than 500,000. Half are West Slope, 2/3 are rural. They include major Front Range suburbs, mountain towns, suburban and rural counties. Collectively, we represent nearly 1/4 of Colorado's population. At this point in the evening, I don't think I can offer anything that you all haven't heard, so I will keep it brief. But it is important to our members that you all know that these views are shared by a bunch of local governments around the state. First, in our view, bonding requirements, implementation, and enforcement should follow the simple principle that neither state taxpayers nor local communities should bear the burden of the costs and impacts of inactive or abandoned wells. Second, it should not be possible for operators to game the system in order to avoid these responsibilities. And other speakers have flagged a bunch of the ways that this happens. You all certainly know how that works. Third, it's crucial that enforcement actions are taken quickly enough to expeditiously eliminate hazards and that they are steep enough to serve as effective deterrents. Fourth, because understanding these methane emissions is so critical to meeting the state's GHG emissions targets, methane monitoring should be required on all inactive and abandoned wells. And then finally, pollution liability requirements should be strong enough to actually protect communities and public health. If the oil and gas industry is going to continue to operate in Colorado, they should be required to take responsibility for the impacts of those activities rather than cutting their own expenses by shifting those costs to taxpayers. CC4CA represents a wide range of communities across different parts of the state, but our members all share the view that operators should be responsible for protecting the communities in which they operate and repairing the damage they cause. If the system allows them to evade those responsibilities, then we need to fix the system. On behalf of all 36 of our local governments, we very much thank you for the work. That is sincere. We genuinely appreciate your efforts. We know how hard you work and look forward to remaining engaged in this process, and I hope you all get to wrap up soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, for the comments and being with us here this evening. It's appreciated. Next up is Steve Walcott, and then Heidi Cedar-Keshet. Mr. Walcott, you're still muted.
There, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. So I'm Steve Walcott. I'm from Delta County, and I just want to briefly point out that there's an existing example of a system that has worked fairly well in assuring that reclamation is accomplished and paid for by the extracting entity. This example comes from the coal mining industry in Colorado. For a decade or so, I sat on the North Fork Coal Working Group as a representative of the local conservation organization. This working group was convened by Delta County and successfully brought together the 3 local underground coal mines, local residents, and organizations concerned with minimizing and mitigating the impacts of coal mining. The mines were required by the permitting agency, the Colorado Mine Land Reclamation Board, to provide performance bonds in amounts necessary to cover the costs of reclamation. The Mine Land Reclamation Board website lists as some of its responsibilities to ensure that performance bonds are adequate and remain in force for all permitted operations, and to inspect all permitted operations. The key to the success of this approach is that ensure that performance bonds are adequate and remain in force for all permitted operations. A blanket bond does not work. A regulator must review the reclamation plan and certify that the bond amount is adequate. And then inspections must take place to make sure what is happening on the ground and under the ground can be addressed by the reclamation plan and the bond amount. I suggest that you consult and work with the Mine Land Reclamation Board to learn the details and procedures necessary to make this work. If these conditions are met, bonding works. In our experience in the North Fork Valley, the coal mines were diligent in completing their reclamation because they wanted their bond released. They wanted to be able to get a good price on the next bond for the next project. This is why separate bonds for different projects are important. And the regulating agency must certify to the bonding company that the reclamation is complete in order for the bond to be released. So if this bonding is adequate, required to be adequate, the risk of incomplete or no reclamation is removed from the state and taxpayers. The bonding company takes the responsibility of evaluating the financial health of the company and assumes the risk of default. So self-bonding does not accomplish this, nor blanket bonding. So in a system like this, a company has a financial incentive to complete reclamation and get their bond release. I just point out that if this can work for coal mines, it can work for oil and gas wells. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Walcott, for being here with us tonight and providing those comments and sticking through towards the end. Last on our list is Heidi Cedar-Keshet.
Can you guys hear me?
We can see you and hear you.
Okay. I'm H. Cedar-Keshet. I live in Paonia, Colorado in Delta County. in the North Fork of the Gunnison Valley. My personal experience with the extractive industries in the North Fork has been one filled with disappointment and fear. I am an artist who does plein air oil painting, which is outside, and a taxpayer. I've seen extractive industries get out of reclamation that they promised to do. This means me, the taxpayer, has to absorb the cost. The current COGCC bonding levels are inadequate to fully protect the state, taxpayers, and communities from absorbing the cleanup costs and damages caused by oil and gas operations. I would like to relate my personal experience with Colorado's extractive industries' consistent non-compliance with remediation. And I feel that somehow my placement after Steve Walcott is going to be enlightening. Not long ago, I was plein air painting on the side of the road that runs along the non-operating Bowie coal mines gob pile. I was trying to get a painting together for an exhibit I was in. A man drove up and asked me what I was doing. I explained my painting technique to him. He told me he worked for Bowie Mine and had to come out and start up the backhoe and drive it around a couple times a week to keep our state government happy. After that, he told me how beautiful the area we were in used to be before the coal mine destroyed it. He related the beauty of the orchards blossoming in the spring and the golden color of the cottonwoods in the fall. The gob pile is still there. Nothing is being reclaimed, and Bowie coal mine is getting out of cleaning up that mess due to rezoning by Delta County. This long-standing behavior of a promise broken, reclamation manipulated, and avoided is commonplace among Colorado's extractive industries. Our state has thousands of abandoned gas wells that belong to out-of-business extractive companies. The state has to pay the cost of capping and fixing this environmental damage. That means me, the taxpayer, is paying for extractive businesses to go broke and not pay to clean up the air, land, and water. I have to pay for that cleanup as a taxpayer. I've been asking you commissioners, please adopt financial assurance laws that will be relevant for the future in appropriate form that ensures taxpayers do not absorb the operator's cost of regulatory compliance. I have to live with the pollution these dangerous extractive industries create. I want to live in a healthy, clean, and beautiful place, not a gob pile, not an abandoned gas pad. Please take actions that ensure that these extractive companies absorb the total cost of their operations, including environmentally sound remediation. Thank you all very much for your time and for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Keshet, for your comments and for hanging in there till the end. We appreciate it. Commissioners, that concludes the public comment for this evening. There is on the agenda an opportunity for commissioner comments. Does anyone wish to comment? Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to thank everybody for taking the time out of their evenings to come and provide us with their comments. We really appreciate it. And just again, reiterating what Chair Messner said at the beginning, that if you have comments written in written format, please send them to us, and that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa. Agreed on that. And so anyone else have anything they want to comment on? So with that, I believe, Mr. Davenport, we want to have a motion for adjournment, or are we, and then starting again tomorrow morning, or do we not adjourn?
No, I think it's appropriate to adjourn, have a motion to adjourn until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Okay. So I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned, and we'll see everyone tomorrow morning for round 2.
Good night, everybody.
Round 3. So thanks. Have a good evening.